Welcome to Encounter Grace. I'm Jason McKnight, and I'm glad you're here. I'm alone in the studio today. It's because this is the first of a three-part series on leading with increased capacity. Imagine if you could lead teams and family and friends. In fact, imagine if you could do all of life with 20%, let's say, 20% fewer bad interactions with other people, spouse, teammates, kids, boss. We've all been there. Someone offers feedback and that gets misunderstood. There's a sharp retort. Now we've got hurt feelings and the relationship comes to a standstill until we heal this. What if we could grow in our capacity to handle the stuff that comes our way, even if it's misunderstood? Well, in part one today, we dip into a recent Leadership Lab seminar here at Grace Fellowship. And so I invite you to join me as we listen to Justin Tillman unpack how leadership and spiritual maturity are all interconnected with emotional capacity and relational abilities. So enjoy.
So I want you to do a little thought experiment with me. I want you to close your eyes and I want you to think about the most spiritually mature person that you know of. Or that you knew of, then maybe they're not with us anymore. And take a few minutes and think about who that person is and what qualities you saw in them. All right, so if you've got that in your mind, now what I want you to do, I want you to imagine that you find out that they frequently lash out in anger, they completely avoid difficult conversations, and they struggle with deep-seated shame. Does that change your perspective on their spiritual maturity? Maybe especially that first one, they lash out in anger constantly, really short temper. Nobody wants to be around them. They walk on eggshells. So today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about a side of leadership, a side of spiritually mature leadership that, if I'm honest, I haven't really thought about before. When we think about leadership, we think about getting tasks done. We think about, getting our teams together right, looking at people's strengths and looking at their weaknesses and who do we put in certain positions. What we're going to talk about tonight is leadership from a different angle, and it's leadership in terms of emotional and relational capacity and how that ultimately builds us up into spiritually mature leaders. So a couple years back, Spring Health did some research in the workplace, and they said 70% of leaders, 70%, so that's 7 out of 10, were overwhelmed in their role as a leader, completely overwhelmed. And that about 50% minimum experienced some shade of burnout while being a leader. And their teams felt the exact same way. Exact same way. 7 out of 10 leaders, 7 out of 10 team members feel emotionally overwhelmed, physically overwhelmed in their roles, and about 50% experience burnout. That's a high number. That's a really high number. I'm not great at math, and I know that's a high number. And the statistics, they highlight a significant issue for us, that leadership is, you can have all the tools in your tool belt. You can have the best team in the world. But if you don't know how to relate to one another, you're not going to be as effective as you could be. And so tonight, what we're going to talk about is how do we do that? What does it look like to be emotionally mature, relationally mature, spiritually mature as a leader? And then how does that play out in our relationships with our teams? Because by mastering these concepts, we can really transform not only our leadership, but the effectiveness of the people we lead, and even better, the lives of the people that we lead. I want you to think of your teams, and when I say teams, it might not be a workplace. If you have a family, guess what? You've got a team. If you've got kids, you've got a team. If you've got brothers and sisters, you've got a team. Somebody is watching you. It might be people in your community. It might be neighbors. Your community is a team. And so don't think, well, my title at work isn't director or manager. That doesn't matter. You're a leader. And if you have people that you are leading, you are a steward of those people. And so how do we steward them well? And it's not just getting tasks done. It's also about, part of stewardship is also about making them a better person, helping them grow in Christ-likeness. So that's what we're going to talk about tonight. And so it's going to be a little bit different twist on leadership. Not going to be any fancy acronyms as far as productivity or things like that. We do have some acronyms for you, but none related to production. So first one I want to talk about is emotional maturity. So what is emotional maturity? We'll also call it emotional capacity, but it's the ability to maintain joy, regulate emotions, develop and utilize relational skills, heal from past traumas, and I know that's a loaded word, we'll unpack that a little bit, and build resilience. So when we say emotional capacity, that's what we're talking about, emotional maturity. It's that ability to maintain joy, regulate emotions, develop and utilize relational skills, heal from past traumas, and build resilience. Why does that matter? Have you ever worked for an emotionally immature leader before? I have. How fun was that? Yeah. So you can already see how important emotional maturity is to effective leadership. Yes, there are leaders. If you just count effectiveness as getting the job done, then there are a lot of really effective leaders out there. But if you think of leadership beyond just getting the job done and about shepherding people and stewarding people, then this is a key piece to that, our emotional maturity and our emotional capacity. So emotional capacity refers to our ability to handle the 6 primary negative emotions. And we're going to talk about negative emotions. Some people say, well, Justin, what about positive emotions? Well, those aren't hard to handle. Those are fun. What do we do with the negative ones? What do we do with the ones that just keep us up at night, get our blood pressure up, make us want to just withdraw from people? What do we do with those? And so when we talk about emotional capacity, that's our ability to bounce back from those negative emotions. And so what are those negative emotions? I'm glad you asked. They are sadness, anger, disgust, shame, anxiety, and despair. If you want an acronym, just say sad, because that's what they are. They make you sad. But yeah, sadness, anger, disgust, shame, anxiety, and despair. Raise your hand if you've ever felt one of those 6. All right, we got some liars in here, and we got some people who know their emotions. So tonight is it's not a therapy session. This isn't counseling, but this stuff is important because guess what? You have emotions. You have them right now. You are feeling a certain way right now. You might be annoyed. You might be excited. You might be disgusted by the time the night's over. I don't know. But you're feeling one of these emotions, or you're feeling an emotion, whether it's joy or happiness, or you might be feeling anxiety. But good luck finding a time in your day where you don't feel an emotion. God's given them to us. They're part of what colors the life around us and colors our life. So they're not bad. There's a good place for sadness. There's a good place for anxiety. There's a right place for every one of these negative emotions. The problem is when they overflow where they're supposed to be. So as a leader, you're going to get angry sometimes. I guarantee it. You're going to be anxious sometimes. You're going to feel despair. They're not bad. Sometimes I get my best work done when I'm anxious. But it's a problem when it boils over and it completely incapacitates me. That's when it becomes a problem. So the more emotionally mature we are, the more capacity we have to deal with these emotions before they become that spillover into the rest of our life. And we don't lose our sense of identity. We don't lose the sense of who we are, and we don't lose our composure. Anybody here ever lost their composure before? Nobody wants to raise their hand on that one. I'll raise my hand. My wife's here, so I got to raise my hand on that one. So what emotional maturity does is, again, it helps us manage these emotions without losing our sense of identity and without losing composure. So we're able to cope with all of those emotions, all 6 of them. You are able to handle those emotions until your capacity has been reached. So think of it like a box. For each one of those 6 emotions, you've got a box of a certain size. And you can take, but eventually that box fills up if you don't clean it out. And so what we're talking about is, well, what happens when there's that one extra drop? And the thing with emotions is that one extra drop doesn't just spill over. What happens with emotions is when that one extra drop goes in, the whole thing just spills over. So if I'm dealing with anxiety, I'm doing okay. And then there's one little added thing, that straw that breaks the camel's back. And it's not just, oh, I just freak out a little bit. The whole thing just breaks apart. The whole box explodes. And so what we want to talk about tonight is how do we make that box bigger? How do we make that box bigger? Because when the box explodes, you switch into what we call enemy mode. And enemy mode is just what it sounds like. The person becomes a problem. The people become a problem. And the first thing we want to do is make that negative emotion go away. How do we get away from it as quickly as possible? So it might be lashing out in anger. It might be withdrawing, shutting down, whatever it takes to make the emotion stop. And oftentimes, because we're in enemy mode, the person becomes the problem. And so what do I have to do to get you to stop? And that's where the hurtful words come out, or the relationship breaks down, because I just want the feeling to go away. But there's a better way to handle it, which is why we're here tonight. So I want to illustrate this point. I have plenty of examples of anxiety, but where I used to work, and my wife's here, so I'll change the names to protect the innocent, mainly me. But where I used to work was a stressful job. I was the dean of workforce development for the community college here in Kinston, the third largest workforce development third largest workforce development division in the whole state, and the largest per capita. So if you compared us to Wake Tech, we were bigger when you considered our population, bigger by far compared to our population. That's a stressful job. Constantly having things coming down at you. And if you've ever worked in education, I know we got lots of teachers in here, it's like 1 minute you're focusing on this thing, and then by the time you've got that situated, there's a new initiative coming down. And oftentimes, it doesn't line up with the one you just implemented. It completely conflicts with it. So you're like, what are we doing here? Add on top of that, you've got associate deans, I've got faculty, and they all have their own ideas about everything. And middle management's just a tight place to be. You're pinched from both sides. And I'd say the last 2 or 3 years that I was there, it was intense anxiety. Just never knew what I was going to step into. And that was fine until it wasn't. And eventually I reached a point where my capacity, I just reached it. And so once I did that anxiety didn't stay at work. That anxiety followed me home. And so what would probably be just no ill intent comment, Ellen might say something, and I would react completely inappropriately based on the comment. It wasn't a bad comment, but because of my capacity, I just had it. I didn't have any more space for anything else. And so it affected my relationship with my wife. It affected my relationship with my boys. I was very short with them. I didn't have anything else to give. I was full and my box was overflowing. And so how many people have ever been in that spot before? Have you ever been there? Okay, good, I'm not alone. That's what we're talking about. You're a human being. You have a capacity level for these emotions. And every day, a little bit gets poured in, a little bit gets poured in, a little bit gets poured in. And so you got to do something with that. So that's emotional capacity. So the next thing I want to talk about is not just emotional maturity and capacity, but relational maturity. So what is relational maturity? That's the ability to build and sustain joyful, empathetic, and secure relationships. Joyful, empathetic, and secure relationships. A phrase you're going to hear tonight is called returning to joy. Returning to joy. So what relational maturity is, it's that ability to return to joy from those 6 negative emotions. Because like I said, when we're positive emotions, we don't want to get away from those. We don't want to return to anything from that. We want to keep experiencing those. But what do we do with these negative emotions that really break down our ability to relate with others? How do we bounce back from that? How do we return to joy? And so when we have relational maturity, when we have the skills to relate to other people, we can empathize with others. We can go about healing past wounds in our relationships. And we can develop relational skills that help us interact with people even when we're angry, even when we're sad, even when we're disgusted, even when we're annoyed. Because like I said, you're not gonna get away from those emotions. They're gonna happen. What do you do when they happen? And so the bigger our relational capacity, the more relational skills we have in our toolbox, the better we are able to interact with other people and maintain the relationship while also addressing the problem. Because that's the thing. Nothing we talk about tonight doesn't mean that you're going to walk out and your next step in leadership, everything's going to go hunky-dory. No, you're going to run into a situation where you get upset. And so what we're talking about tonight, well, how do I deal with that being upset, which may very well be the right emotion to have, without tearing the relationship apart? So if I'm angry at you for something you've done, how do we work through that without taking the easy way out of just saying, well, let's just stop being friends. Let's just stop working together. Let's just stop. I don't want to see you anymore. Let's just withdraw. Because that's what the enemy wants to happen. The enemy wants to tear relationships apart. So how do we interact with those emotions that God has given us? Because Scripture says, be angry, but don't sin in your anger. Scripture doesn't say don't ever be angry. It just says don't sin in your anger. So how do we do that? How can we be angry and deal with the real problem while maintaining the relationship that you have with the person in front of you? And so that's relational maturity. I think I skipped a slide. We don't actually ever, or at least I didn't, connect emotional maturity and relational maturity to spiritual maturity. I think so often we kind of put spiritual maturity over in this box by itself. I read my Bible a lot, I pray a lot, so I'm spiritually mature. But when you walk out the door, that's the little thought experiment we did at the beginning. You might read your Bible every day, have a great prayer life. When you walk out the door and you blow up at the person you see, is that spiritually mature? Maybe, maybe not. But that's the part that person's going to remember. They don't care that you read your Bible and you prayed that morning. They're going to care that you just yelled at them and said some really hurtful things. And so these things go together. Our lives are not secular and sacred. They are completely together. There is no divide between the two. And so we don't often connect emotional and relational maturity with spiritual maturity, but they're inseparable. They're completely, you can't have one without the others. You can't be spiritually mature and have zero relational skills and zero emotional capacity. And I'd argue you can't be emotionally mature if you're not spiritually mature. They all go together. And if you'll notice the fruit of the Spirit, how many of those are relational? Love, joy, peace, patience. Patience requires another person. Kindness requires another person. Gentleness requires another person. Faithfulness requires another person. Goodness, self-control. Self-control, that's got self in it, so maybe it doesn't require another person, but the other ones do. So even the fruit of the Spirit is relational. How do we relate to one another? You see that in Paul's writing in the New Testament. He's oftentimes calling them to better ways of relating together in that community. And so God really does care. Yes, God cares that you read Scripture. Yes, God cares that you pray. But God also cares about how you relate to the people in front of you. So that's why I gave that a little thought experiment at the beginning of who's this most spiritually mature person you can think of. And now imagine the fact that they completely fly off the handle every time they turn around. If I'm being honest, it drops that spiritual maturity in my eyes a little bit, even if just a percentage point. It affects it. I don't go, oh, well, they're just as spiritually mature as they were. Think of how many Christian leaders have had a failure over the past 5 years, who we would say, man, that was a spiritually mature Christian leader. And then we found out what was going on behind closed doors. And chances are you could tie it back to their emotional and their relational capacity. Maybe they chose inappropriate relationships to deal with shame and anxiety in an unhelpful way. So these people that we would put on pedestals say that's a really spiritually mature person, now they got knocked down a few rungs because of their emotional and their relational skills. So what does all that have to do with leadership? Well, leadership requires that we engage with people. I love what John Maxwell says. If you think you're leading but nobody is following, then you're just out for a walk. So leading, by definition, requires other people. And so if we're going to be leaders, whether that's in our home, in our work, in our ministries, if we're going to be leaders, we're going to be interacting with other people. And so we need to be emotionally and relationally mature. And so I hope you're starting to see now the connection between the two. And when it comes to leading others, some problems are getting tasks accomplished, but 99.9% of leadership problems are people problems. If you're leading people well, oftentimes the tasks are getting done. Usually if a task isn't getting done, it's rare that it's a systems issue or it's a technical issue. A lot of times it's a relational people problem. And so since leadership requires that we work with people, we have to be emotionally, spiritually, and relationally mature. People are most effectively, when we talk about returning to joy, people are most effectively led by positive goals. The research into the psychology of motivation shows us that when you try to get somebody to change a behavior pattern, it's more effective if they're changing it because of a positive goal as opposed to changing it due to a negative goal. So what do I mean by that? Let's use the example of stop smoking. Okay, well, let's stop smoking or stop overeating. It can be effective. If I just say, hey, I just want to stop smoking because I don't want to get lung cancer. Okay, that's a great goal. And a lot of people have stopped smoking that way. But the research shows us that the way our brains are wired, a much more effective way is I want to stop overeating or I want to stop smoking because I want a healthier life. I want to be here for my grandkids. I want to be here to experience these things. The goal is still sort of the same. It's the motivation behind it, that positive motivation. You can push someone into a goal or you can draw them into it. And it's much more effective and much more long-lasting when they're drawn into that goal as opposed to being pushed into it. And if you've ever led a team, you might have seen that. You can get the job done by threatening somebody, I'm going to fire you if you don't do this. Yeah, they're going to do it. Or if you engage with them, develop them as a person, they might still do the thing, but they're also going to grow as a person along the way. And so that's what we want to do, is be people who more often than not draw people into the goal of our team, of our family, of our ministry. Draw them into it instead of pushing. Now, sometimes you're just going to have to push them, but we want the default to be we're drawing people into this good thing. Because what happens when you push people into something, they burn out because they're not engaged. They don't want to do it. They don't feel capable of doing it. They're dealing with all those same emotions and they get burnt out. If you can draw them into it, if you can help develop them as a person, if you can remain relational with them where they feel like I'm connected, I belong on this team, I have a sense of identity among this team, whether that's a family, a ministry, whatever, they're gonna grow. They're gonna grow as people, and the burnout rate has been shown to be much lower because they get a sense of self almost from what they're doing in a healthy way. They haven't meshed their identity with the team in an unhealthy way, but they've meshed it in such a way where these are my people, and I love what we're doing, and I'm bought into it, and I want to be a part of it. Another big area this shows up in is the way that we have difficult conversations with people. Who in here has ever had to have a conversation with someone about something that person did that made you upset? Okay, yeah. Thank you. You raised your hand. Whether it was a coaching conversation or whether it was a corrective conversation. If you're in the workspace, we had them all the time. Performance evaluations. Everybody hates that word. Especially if it resulted in a performance improvement plan. Nobody liked those either. But to be effective leaders, you're going to have those difficult conversations. I don't care how well your team operates, how well your family is. You're a human being. And so there's going to come a time where you have to have a difficult conversation with somebody because they're going to say something that hurts you, or you're going to say something that hurts them, or you're not going to do something the way they wanted it done, or they're not going to do it the way you want it done. It's going to happen. And so what do we do in those situations? Well, when we build our emotional capacity, when we build our tool belt of relational skills, we can have that conversation in an effective way. You still have the conversation. The problem still needs to be addressed. This is not brushing anything under the rug, but how can we have that conversation in a way that best sets us up to maintain the relationship? Again, nothing we're talking about tonight is a silver bullet. You can do all these things and the relationship might still break down. It might happen. It's not a perfect world. But with these tools in your tool belt, our hope is that as we interact with each other and have difficult conversations, that the relationship stays and we're still able to communicate and we're still able to be in relationship together. So when it comes to addressing emotional capacity, we have two options. You can either make the box bigger or you can clean out the box. So if you got a small box, but you're constantly cleaning it out, you're probably not going to get overwhelmed. But tonight, we're going to talk about mainly how to make the box bigger. Not so much about cleaning the box out. There are ways to do that. But what we're going to talk about tonight is, well, how do we give ourselves a bigger box? How do we give ourselves a bigger box? Because we avoid difficult conversations because we're afraid of the emotion attached to it. I might not have the conversation with you because I can't stand feelings of anxiety. Can't stand them. I don't like it. And so if I think the conversation is going to lead me to become anxious, I'm just not going to have the conversation. So the problem goes unaddressed and it just makes it worse because we never actually address the problem. So if we can learn ways to return to ourselves, to return to a sense of calm, if I can learn ways to deal with anxiety so that I'm not afraid of it, then I'm much more apt to have the difficult conversation that needs to happen for us to grow as a team or grow as in our relationship together. Because if I do get anxious, I know what to do to calm it down or to get out of that feeling of anxiety. So again, what we're going to talk about tonight is relational skills and ways to make that box bigger so that you don't feel as overwhelmed as quickly. And I encourage you, what you learn tonight, put it into practice the minute you walk out this door. Because these are skills, they are tools. You have to use them. I had to use them literally yesterday. I was talking to Susan about it this morning. I had to start employing some of these tools with anxiety yesterday. Just returning to joy and how to calm myself and how to get my box a little bit bigger and stop spilling things over. So I feel very practical. And so as we go through tonight, as we talk about what's going on in the brain with Jason next, and then we talk about practical ways to work these things out, I want you to suspend judgment for the rest of the night and just try these things out. Some of these things are going to be like, well, duh, I've been doing that. I just didn't know what it was called. Some of these things might be new for you. I didn't even think about that. But our goal tonight is to give you a vocabulary for relational maturity and emotional maturity, because once you have words, it's kind of like a diagnosis. Once you can diagnose what the issue is, you can treat it. But until you can diagnose it, you can't really treat it. You're just throwing everything at it. So tonight our goal is to give you some vocabulary of what's going on inside of us. How has God created us? How has God wired us? Because what's going on is the enemy is taking what God has done in our minds and our bodies, how he's wired us together, and he's twisting it and he's messing it up. Like I said, emotions are good things, but the problem is when they go over their banks. And a lot of times that's what the enemy likes to do. He likes to keep pouring and pouring and pouring, because if he can get us to be overwhelmed, then relationships break down and things don't get done. So I hope you're excited. The reason we want to do this with you all, because you're leaders. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with John Maxwell, but one of his 21 irrefutable laws of leadership is called the law of the lid. And that is that your team, your family, your ministry, your work team will not grow beyond your capacity as a leader. You are the lid on your team. And so if you want your team members, if you want your family members, if you want your ministry team individuals to be emotionally mature, have emotional capacity, be able to deal with things and remain relational, then you as a leader need to learn these things, and you need to begin modeling them for the folks that follow you. And so our goal tonight is to help you increase your lid so that your team can increase its lid, because one of the biggest lids for leaders is their emotional maturity. How do they relate to other people?